I'm going to cut the bars with this dagger while these fools make noise, the boy replied proudly. So in short way, you want to muffle a voice that would arouse suspicion? TWOU asked. Yes, that's what I want to do. So let's start now before we die here of thirst and lack of air, Shtendrim said. As for the bars, I can cut them. No offense, David, but I'll make it faster, Nanthornin said. That doesn't offend me at all, David replied with a smile, handing the giant a tool that might have saved them from a terrible death. Nanthornin went to the bars, sat down, and grabbed one of them. That one moved. The giant with a strong hand without much problem tore out the lattice. We already have one out, he replied with a smirk. Unfortunately, other bars did not break so easily. They had to be cut. Nanthornin began to saw the lattice with a new tool. All the noise was drowned out by the work of the goblins. Incredibly fast movements of the trained warrior's hand in almost 5 minutes halved more than half of the lattice. The worst prison ever, David said. The worst prison might be for those monsters, but for us it's the best prison ever, TWOU corrected. And anyway, what does the word ever mean? He added after a while. It doesn't matter. Let's not bother now about it, David replied, not wanting to explain to the boy for an hour what that word is and what country it comes from. If he had said the meaning of the word, he would have to explain to him what its origin was, and TWOU would not have stopped asking questions about this mysterious, unfamiliar word. The boy nodded and then stopped talking. Nanthornin cut the first lattice. Now Poppin, Cordrin, TWOU and David could pass through this way, but I and the others are unlikely to fit in. He said I have to cut one more lattice. Let no one leave yet, he added after a while. The giant began to saw another lattice, but after a while the sounds of work in the mine unexpectedly died down. Nanthornin quickly stopped his occupation. Someone is going, he whispered. The team knew that. Everyone heard the footsteps. Open the door, TWOU, said a muted voice outside. The team, hearing the sound from the gagged door, hurriedly began to feign terror. After a while, the thick door opened creasing terribly and 2 goblins armed to the teeth entered. Immediately afterwards, a very tall figure appeared in the door, whose face was not yet visible through the darkness. Behind her came another 2 goblins with torches in their hands. Now 9 prisoners could see the mysterious tall lord of the goblins. Purple robes covered the shiny steel armor applied to the proud chest, and the gilded ornaments on the armor shone wonderfully in the glow of the torch. The knee-length leather shoes were colored black. Only the face of the ruler could not be seen through the scattered, black hood and steel mask resembling the face of a handsome and proud man. Here are prisoners, my lord, said the goblin, who had previously ordered an insidious net to be unleashed on the intruders. He bowed slowly. They were searched, added monster. Really? And why do I see armor on some of them? Asked the ruler in a proud, hushed voice, and them came dangerously close to the cage. At any moment he could see the bars cut. Bago decided to act quickly. O great lord, have mercy on us, do not gasp us such a curly way, show us grace. I'm stubborn and it's the merchants who walked with me. For sure you're just a squirm, begging for mercy now, but don't think I'm just going to let you out of here. Lord, hearing this, the evil ruler laughed for a moment. You are the first to break in here. When I let you go, you will say everything. Rot here. Okay, but I have such a little question, said Bago, as if he did not care about anything. If we are here as first, so is why here are the remains, he asked. In fact, he did it only to distract the ruler from the cut bars. They did not break in, but were kidnapped, the tyrant replied mockingly. And anyway, I know that you are spies. Even your appearance suggests it. He suddenly raised his voice. You have probably been hired. You wanted to rob me and investigate my hiding place. Yes. The ruler began to scream, but the expression on his face through the mask could not be seen. Scammers, liars, thieves, rot useless corpses here. The ruler fell into a real fury. He began to fade into the frenzy, until suddenly his gaze stopped in the place of the cut bars. What is this supposed to mean, oh lord? It was just like that. I can fix these, Bago replied goofily. The evil ruler, however, was not to be laughed at. You said they were searched, broke out on the goblin. Yes sir, B. The monster did not have time to finish his speech because his master with his bare hands twisted his neck. The ruler threw his limed body on the ground like a wet rag. When he had completed this brutal execution, he ran to the cage, drawing a sword from behind his back, and attacked Nanthornin, who was closest to him. The warrior, however, turned out to be faster and stabbed the tyrant with a dagger in the right side, piercing the steel. The ruler moved in pain and quickly jumped cowardly to flee. The evil lord disappeared behind the door. The team ran out of the bar. Only Nanthonin had to use a lot of force to squeeze through. Meanwhile, 2 goblins attacked them, but in a second there was no obstacle. Shtendrim and Nethin took the weapons of the monsters to have something to defend themselves. Others had to wait. "We have to find our weapons," said Poppin. Hearing this, David immediately spoke. "Surely our weapons are in stock not far away. When they led us to prison, I watched everything around me." Nanthonin nodded his head in appreciation. "So we're going to give a thud to these monsters and Mirentagon?" Terhin shouted. "Wait, this psychopath in the mask was a Mirentagon?" David was interested. "Of course it does. And what did you thinking?" "The prince," the boy replied. "There is no time for conversations now," shouted Poppin, seeing more enemies approaching. The team began to run straight towards the warehouse. After a while, they entered the warehouse surrounded by a barrier. Nanthonin closed the gate behind him at the last minute. Goblins from all sides pushed against the barriers trying to get to the burglars. "Find your weapons," shouted the giant, pushing on the door. "Mine too," he added after a moment. "The first monster has already passed through the wall." Nethin killed him with a goblin axe in a few moments, but he knew that when enemies appeared more, it would not be easy. After a minute, if not more, everyone was already holding their property in their hands. The goblins rammed the gate and poured like a river into the warehouse. The team began to fight. Nanthonin wreaked the most havoc. It was as if he was a farmer who cut down a congregation with a scythe. After a while, the team could finally leave the warehouses, leaving behind a pile of bodies. From the prison side, however, goblin reinforcements began to run. Unfortunately, there were far too many of them, so the escapees decided to flee. Celian only turned backwards from time to time to shoot individual enemies with a bow. The team moved towards one of the bridges on which the tracks rested. David ran forward until after a while he realized that there was no one around him. He turned and stopped and saw his companions fighting a group of monsters. Suddenly, he heard a disturbing voice. He looked ahead again and saw a goblin running towards him. He fell to the ground in terror, but fortunately Celian saw his friend in danger. He was going to shoot a bow, but of course he had to run out of arrows. David desperately grabbed his sword, but a Pokrika with a rod studded with spikes pounced on him. When he was about to deliver a blow, he suddenly froze in stillness. He looked ahead. David was surprised to see the behavior of the monster. Suddenly, the monster screamed in terror like a monkey. The boy rose to a half-lying position and saw that suddenly the goblin was hit by something white with a triangular shape. Monster lost his balance and began to nap like a wild beast. She stepped back clumsily and fell into the abyss. David tried to calm down and realize what had just happened. Was it a paper plane? He wondered. He turned backwards and saw his comrades who had just killed a group of goblins. Celian was holding another paper bird in his hand. The other 7 pairs of eyes stared at the scout. "What happened?" asked Terhin, who didn't know what Celian had just done. No one answered his question. Everyone stared at David once and once at Celian. They were distracted only by the fact that they heard the screams of more goblins. "Those pigs again." Terhin broke down. "To not insult pigs." Baga was outraged. Nanthonin looked ahead until he suddenly stopped looking at something. "Quickly, to the wagons," he cried. The team obediently ran after the giant across a wooden bridge. When they ran through it, they were attacked by another group of monsters which jumped out suddenly from behind the wagons. Nanthonin has already fought these monsters as if casually. "Get in, quickly," he cried out, seeing a large horde of more savages running across the bridge. The poor construction creaked and shook under hundreds of feet of wild creatures. Meanwhile, everyone except Nanthonin was already in the carriages. The giant began to push the roller coaster so that it could gain speed, and when he decided that he was already going, he jumped into the last car quite quickly. Goblins in a frenzy began to chase the escaped prisoners through a dark and narrow tunnel. Monsters had no intention of simply giving up. Chapter 19. Nanthonin began to move from wagon to be closer to his friends. The tunnel was very tight, so he had to be very careful. In addition, they went down a bit, which did not make his task any easier. After a while, however, he found himself right behind Nethin's back. Behind him there was still a large piece of wagons attached to each other. Suddenly, after a while, The wagons began to shake strangely. "What's going on?" David was worried, who was sitting in the carriage at the very front. After a while, he heard the answer: "Goblin screams." "They are trying to get to us," Nanthornin replied calmly. He turned backwards and saw the goblins standing on the last of the wagons. "They got in," shouted the giant towards their comrades. "What the? How did they get there?" What Nathan was surprised. "Goblins get to us on wagons," Nanthornin replied more accurately and more calmly. "Have you heard? Get ready." The young man started shouting. "Relax, don't worry Nathan, I'll handle them on my own," the giant replied, seeing only 4 stray skinny people in the back. "What's going on?" Turpin became interested, disturbed by the cry of the great warrior. "Don't worry boy," Nanthornin continued. David listened to the conversation, but he didn't hear much behind him. Suddenly, he saw a pale light in front of him, which was getting bigger and bigger with each passing moment. "I think I see the exit from the tunnel," he informed the comrades. "That's good," said Poppin, sitting right behind the boy. David looked ahead again. "Wait, what is happening?" David said, but he did not even finish his speech because suddenly the bridge in front of them simply exploded. A huge bang echoed off the walls of the tunnel, causing a great shock. Everyone was really terrified. David revealed his eyes again and saw that the entire central part of the bridge had collapsed. "Run!" The bridge collapsed. He began to yell so that everyone could hear him. Unfortunately, the walls of the terribly tight tunnel did not allow them to jump out of the wagons, because there was simply no place on the sides, so the only thing that they have left is to run backwards from wagons so as not to fall into a dark abyss in front of them. Everyone started to get up as soon as possible. "Fast! Run backwards!" cried Poppin. The team began to run on speeding wagons. Bago wanted to take Poppin and Cordrin under his armpits, but his tightness did not allow him to do so. Meanwhile, Nanthornin had to quickly defeat 4 goblins so that he could pass safely with his companions. David, at the very end, that is, at the same time closest to the collapsed bridge, jumped desperately from wagon to wagon. Bago, however, seemed to be not paying attention to the great danger. He even found time to take off his hat, which made it difficult for him to escape. Faster! David was still yiking, whose heart went up to his throat. His heart beat like crazy, like possessed. Even when he was attacked recently by a feral goblin on the previous bridge, he did not feel so terrified. The others ran over the bodies of the dead goblins. Only David, terrified, remained at the grey end. His legs trembled with fear, but the boy under the influence of indescribable adrenaline ran without fatigue. He tried not to panic and not look back, but it was not easy. The roller coaster had already left the tunnel and the first of the wagons began to fall into the abyss while David was still outside the tunnel. This was fatally bad news that David refused to accept. This meant that the carriages were going faster than he was running. The boy sped up. Meanwhile, Nanthornin was the first to finally jump out of the last wagon and found himself in a tunnel on the tracks. He was followed by Nathan, Turpin and Shtendri. Then Celian jumped on the tracks and fell to his knees through shaking legs. Bago, still in the wagon, threw Poppin. "Catch him!" he cried. Nanthornin caught the halfling without difficulty. After a while, Cordrin also arrived, who was also safely caught. In the end, Bago also jumped out of the last wagon. "And where is David?" Nanthornin was concerned. "Well, on the back I guess, all just meepy at the bottom," Bago replied, quietly turning backwards. "David!" Mudman began to call the boy, without seeing a companion behind him. David, meanwhile, wanted to scream. He had the impression that he was running on the already falling wagons, but he had no intention of checking it, and so his very organism was now literally forcing him to focus only on one goal: escape from death. He jumped and ran as hard as he could in his legs until after a while he finally saw one of the last wagons. Suddenly, he felt more strength in himself. Finally, he began to regain hope for rescue, until suddenly he stumbled at the very end of the wagon. However, he quickly bounced back with sore legs. In this way, he jumped the last 2 wagons, but not entirely. He clumsily hooked his foot on the last carriage and it began to pull him back towards the abyss. At the same time, he scrubbed his body against the beams of the tracks, which destroyed his entire bag. His clothes and other things fell into the dark abyss and after a while disappeared into the dense darkness. Hope was again blurred in his head. He had the impression that a familiar voice was calling him by name, but he thought it was just his imagination. Suddenly, He felt the last wagons fall and began to pull him behind them. After a while, the boy began to fall. Heavy wagons tugged mercilessly at his leg and then let him go. The boy, struggling to survive at the last second, caught the timber carrying the bridge. The beam located a few meters below staggered dangerously when his hands grabbed it. He began to scream like a small child, David, but he had reasons for it. The boy hung for a moment only on one hand over the precipice, but quickly caught himself with the other hand. He opened his eyes and looked down involuntarily. Seeing the endless, dark abyss, he almost let go again. Charred from the explosion, the wooden bale moved dangerously again. Help! The boy started screaming, trying to pull himself up. He looked up in the hope of seeing someone there. Fortunately, after a while he saw the head of Nanthonin and Poppin leaning upwards. The others were probably standing far from the edge. "Hold on!" cried the giant to a terrified David. I turned fan to look at it. The boy heard the voice of Mudman in the air. Nanthonin began to descend the crumbling parts of the bridge. David, using all his strength, finally managed to pull himself up to the hanging bale. When he did it, the construction shook unpleasantly and creaked. He felt bad, to tell the least. What if the beam can't withstand its weight right away? It will fall and he probably not even rather, but for sure, the boy thought, seeing the endless depths. After a while, he heard a loud bang echoing downstairs. Probably the wagons have only now fallen to the bottom. This hole must have been really deep since they had been falling for so long. After a while, Nanthonin finally got close enough to reach out to the boy. David raised his hand up so that the giant could grab him, but just at that moment the beam under his knees detached from the only remaining column of the destroyed bridge. If it had not been for Nanthonin's rapid, even superhuman reaction, the boy would have already fallen into the abyss. The giant held the board with his right hand and David with his left hand. The giant, however, did not show any inexplicable strength at all. The shadow warrior decided to help the companions hanging over the dark hole. Poppin also broke up, but Bago stopped him with the force of his big hands. "Jow can't have a hand," reminded Muddy, closing his eyes all the time so as not to look at the terrible scene in the bottom. The halfling had no idea how Bago, not seeing him, grabbed his only hand. Nathan came closer to the edge of the destroyed structure, but when he saw what was downstairs, he walked away in fear for a few steps. In fact, the term at the bottom did not really fit because you could not see the bottom but just darkness. The young man thought that when he looked into this endless hole in his head, he would lose his balance and fall. Shtendrim went down Nanthonin without the slightest effort through David as if nothing had happened. The boy was terrified, thinking that the worst had happened, but after a while Shtendrim, lying comfortably on several boards, grabbed him with both hands and lifted him upstairs. Now Nanthonin could calmly grab his other hand and start climbing. David watched from above as his rescuer climbed back upstairs. When he made sure that nothing threatened the warrior, he looked at his hands. Red prints under his fingers now adorned his hands, out with effort. His fingers were shaking all the time as if they were tapping on an invisible keyboard, and sweat was pouring from his face as if he had recently come out of the shower. He looked down again to see his hero. Nanthonin looked normal as always. He climbed calmly as if nothing had ever happened, and with a smile on his face. "What is this supposed to mean at all? How he amazes me," the boy thought. After a while, Nanthonin climbed to him and Shtendrim took David and ordered him to climb on the ram. The boy was a little scared, but it was still better than climbing on his own. David climbed cautiously on the giant's back, trying not to look down. Nanthonin signaled to Shtendrim with a hand to follow him and then began to continue climbing. After a while, the rest of the team finally saw Nanthonin, David and Shtendrim go upstairs. The three comrades finally touched the intact base of the wooden bridge with their feet. "For all these dangers threatening me, I demand payment of 6,000 hell rings instead of 5, began to shout a pistless shadow warrior. "Oh no, buddy, we will not agree to this. You wanted to help our friend yourself. Ah, you only did it for the money." Nathan began to laugh sarcastically in response. "And I would agree for his pay. He risked his own life to help me," said an indignant David. "Not long ago you said that he couldn't be trusted," laughed Nathan. David gritted his teeth so as not to curse by chance. "Calm down. Why are you arguing so much? You have not been nice to each other lately," said Nanthonin. "We're one team. We can't be bad for each other. Besides, it's a bad place and time for those stupid and unnecessary conversations." Papin also scolded the two young men with his eyes. Yes, Nathan, David almost died and you start some, I don't know what, TWOU said. We'd better go because I can't stand in this black hole anymore, added the boy after a while, screaming, seeing only black all around. Okay, but one more thing, Nanthornin said. What? TWOU became impatient. Nathan. David, you have to shake hands, the giant finished. Two conflicting friends shook their hands. I am sorry, said the Lord's servant quietly. Never mind, the boy replied, patting his companion on the side because he couldn't even reach his shoulder. Good, let's go, faster, TWOU shouted squeakingly again. Do we have to go through this tunnel again? David asked Nanthornin. Not necessarily. I think it would be possible to jump over it. David looked surprised at the 6-meter distance from the other part of the bridge. What? I almost fell into this black hole a moment ago, and now you want me to just jump over it? The boy began to yell in a slumped voice. Remember when you jumped the river with me? Asked the giant. Yes, but it was only a water and now I have to jump here through a hole, which is probably 1,000,000 kilometers deep. What will be next? If you're so afraid, I can move you there, the giant suggested. I don't want that either, the boy was terrified. A weak rakami process tunal I welcome zetar called a goblin over, Parsnal Nethin. Okay, I'll jump, but just don't be surprised when you see me by smashing into the bottom of this thing. What am I saying? After all, you won't be able to see even this black thing because of it. Hearing this, TWOU took on a strange expression. Good, maybe it will be better if we go through this tunnel, he said. Yes. I'm too little afraid, it is better not to risk, Cordrin agreed. Now the whole team has decided what path they will choose, so they have entered back into the dark tunnel. Probably all the goblins are convinced that we died, but maybe they are not in the tunnel, Papin said aloud. Mirantikan watched the destroyed bridge from his throne in the middle of the stone platform. Oh my lord, we blew up the bridge at your command, said one of the 50 goblins standing in front of the masked ruler. It's not enough for me, you have to immediately check if anyone accidentally survived, Mirantikan replied. The goblin bowed slowly clumsily. I think I've already seen one of these burglars, once, when he was still, added the ruler, but suddenly he broke his statement. After a while, he looked at his bandaged side. The one who hurt me, you must leave alive and bring him to me, kill the rest, gave the order after a while. Hearing this, the squad of monsters bowed low for him. And one more thing, you must attack them with all your might and block their escape, throw their bodies into the manure pit, let them rot there, only the tallest, with black hair, bring him to me, I will tear his skin with my own hands and find out from him who he really is. The cruel ruler began to yell like crazy. Yes, our dear lord, we will do what you punish, the beast in charge of the squad hissed, then gave the order to march. Mirantikan led the squad away with his eyes, and when goblins disappeared from his sight by going down the stairs, he got up and hid behind his throne. He began to mysteriously look around nervously. When he found out that no one could see him, he began to say, Oh my lord, I call you, come to me, O Lord, who illuminates my way with your stars, come to me, Father of light. After a while, a ghost-like blurred figure appeared in front of Mirantikan. Large grey wings covered the torn robes. The face was not visible through the long, disheveled and dirt-grey tangles, only in some places were individual hairs light, which indicated that once all hair had a beautiful color of golden blonde. Call me Miranthiel, my lord, said Mirantikan, bowing down to the very ground. Rise up Miranthiel, ordered a mysterious figure, soaked in darkness all around. Mirantikan, whose real name was Miranthiel, was abjected, and all the time he had his head down. What news do you have for me from this world? Asked the mysterious figure. Sorry, but the news are very bad for now, my lord. As far as I remember, this damned mysterious called Nanthornin came here. What's worse, I noticed that he had a man from the human world with him. What? Screamed suddenly hearing this dark figure. Another man from the other world got here, my lord. When he returns home, he can be a great danger to us, Miranthiel shouted. You don't have to remind me of that, stupid. I know perfectly well what can happen when this human garbage returns to itself. It's pathetic. For the first time in 77 years, someone came here, but none of my servants were to allow anyone to enter this cursed world, screamed a dark figure, after which she began to scratch her face with claws in a frenzy. Lord, no, despair, that's what I'm here for. I have a human body and I will kill this human puppy without any problem. I will wake him up from this pitiful dream. I have already told my people to find him together with other Sasams. So you did a good job though. Now none of the human numerity will threaten the kingdom of darkness from an unknown world. The terrible apparition began to rejoice. She shook her head, which made her hair reveal an ugly smile and eyes, all tar black. For a moment, Merenthiel, seeing the gaze of his lord, bowed his head again. You did a good job. Know, however, that this will unfortunately not be the end yet. Just remember to kill the damned Nanthonin. Every Kirian hound that threaten us are to be wiped out, ordered a disgusting figure. That is my intention, great sovereign. I'm going to strip it of that lovely skin with my own hands, and I'm going to make all these human Kirian hounds look at it. That's good, just remember to do the same with others. The apparition praised him, smiling again, and by showing his yellow and black teeth, the whole three worlds will be plunged into darkness. Ice and fire will consume this earth, and the world of men will fall in its sin. We will hear the crying and lament of the shining him coming from above. A black figure began to shout, but there was an expression of doubt in her eyes. Hearing this, Merenthiel also seemed to have doubts, but he did not show it before his lord. It's time for me. Do not let me down, my servant, said the ruler of darkness, and then took a few steps away. Merenthiel again worshipped all the way to the very ground. To his ruler, I will do what you tell my king, he replied, then looked at his lord. I hope so, replied the Dark Lord, then suddenly transformed into a shining figure, now surrounded by light. Remember that people love us, Merenthiel. Soon you too will become the god of this world. We will all take the golden throne and destroy all these people. The apparition began to laugh. The ghost, which had just been transformed into this miraculous figure, however, did not change one thing in its appearance. Black eyes were still visible under the long hair, and a disgusting smile still appeared on the golden face. I will not let you down, Father of Light, Merenthiel replied, not daring to look the ruler in the face. Hearing this, Lucifer answered nothing, but disappeared after a while suddenly, without any trace. His demonic laughter echoed, and he disappeared. There was complete silence again. Merentigan rose slowly from the ground and turned backwards. To his terror, he saw a goblin looking at him. What happened, Lord? Who did you talk to? Asked the monster, who was not allowed to see the dark apparition. I hope you didn't see anything, Merentigan hissed in response, and threw himself at the creature and gouged out his eyes with his bare hands. The monster squealed terribly in pain and surprise. Mercy, screamed the poor monster. Mercy? Pity? I don't know of such a word, shouted Merentigan, then kicked the unfortunate creature. The goblin fell to the ground and started screaming when it suddenly slipped down. After a while, the monster flew down the stairs, and then fell screaming into the dark abyss. Seeing this, evil ruler began to laugh like a child. I like to look at someone's suffering, especially such stupidness as this. He began to speak to himself, and then sat back on his stone throne. He began to look at the collapsed bridge again. I wish you death, damned people. My master will kill everyone. Everything will be beautiful again. Suddenly, his screams were interrupted by the screams of the goblins. Everyone is supposed to look for burglars, screamed one of the monsters in the bottom. Oh yes, exactly, Merentigan rejoiced when he heard it. Run to the tunnel, shouted another monster, on the other side of the abyss. Merentigan seemed to delight in these words. Yes, kill them, kill, he began to scream in fury. The screams and screams of the goblins intensified, as if rejoicing at the imminent death of the escaped prisoners. Merentigan, however, turned away from the goblins after a while and looked ahead, towards the main staircase, on which a 50-person squad of goblins had recently come down. Tirethadin, the ruler, called one of his servants by name. He settled more comfortably on his throne and began to wait for the arrival of his servant. After a while, he heard a noise of steps. I'm already going, my lord, a hard voice sounded at the bottom. In less than a minute, Merentigan finally saw a servant emerging from below. When Tirethadin came before the throne of the ruler, he bowed low gracefully. Beautiful, long and brown hair, a young face for age and green eyes, added beauty and a friendly look to this man, but a sly smile was painted on his face. I think these damned burglars won't be killed so easily. If they escape from here, you have the task of following them and impersonate as their friend. When the opportunity arises, kill. Only you are best suited for this task. I will do what you punish with great pleasure, replied Tirefadin, blinded by Mirenticum from a young age, ruled by hunger of blood and gold. Just remember to bring the black-haired warrior called Nanthornian alive to me. You will be able to take whatever you want from him, but he will be brought to me alive. I'll kill him myself. Of course, my lord, I will remember, the servant replied. And so it is supposed to be. You know how much I hate human Skirian hounds. Mirenticum screamed suddenly. The servant hearing this was surprised. Sorry for the brightest lord, but, what did you just say, Ag? Nothing like that, my dear, replied the ruler, who had just realized his inattention. I will gladly carry out your order, lord. Perhaps, rest for this time. I can see that you are tired of your work, replied the lovingly trusted servant. Oh yes, I will definitely rest, Mirenticum replied hastily to have peace. Can I bring you something to eat first, lord? Tirefadin continued. You don't have to, Mirenticum replied calmly, but in reality he was losing patience. So maybe I'll bring you bandages? Asked the servant. No. Go away already, right away. The ruler suddenly began to scream in a frenzy. Tirefadin twitched in fear. According to your wishes, my lord, he said quickly, then bowed low, no longer having anything to say. As he began to descend the steep stairs, he suddenly heard the voice of his lord. How I hate these people. I've never seen such an annoying fool before. Chapter 20. Nanthornian was still walking in front of the dark tunnel. Behind him walked the rest of the team, looking constantly under their feet so as not to accidentally stumble on the tracks. We could make a torch, David said. Yes, but we don't have the materials for that. Besides, we are going to get out of the tunnel anyway, Pupping replied. David nodded his head, but when he did, he grimaced. Some dust suddenly poured from above into his face. Hey, do you feel what I feel? He asked. The team turned towards the boy, not understanding anything. That's, Bago was surprised. The earth is shaking. Kind of, vibrates, David replied hesitantly. The team finally paid attention to this only when the shocks intensified. Earthquake, let's run. The ground begins to chip off the ceiling. Let's run. The tunnel is collapsing. David began to panic. No, it's not the earthquake you think, David, Nanthornian replied, and when he said so, it would be like goblin squeals in response. Actually, after a while, they could hear the sounds of feet stomping on the ground. They're running towards us, the giant said. It looks like they won't give up this time, added Poppin. Suddenly, their conversation was interrupted by an even louder shock. Dust poured from above again, which flew into some eyes of them. Nanthornian looked back into the tunnel and saw the pale light of a torch reflecting off the wall. They are already in the tunnel. We have to run. Turn back, he said. No one was going to argue. The shocks gave them a lot to think about. There are probably millions of these things, David yelled out, not paying attention to the fact that his companions were already running back towards the collapsed bridge. Only Nanthornian, who was now at the very end, chased the boy to escape. After a while, David and his friends ran back into the tunnel. The light behind them, however, was getting brighter. Well, no, the boy broke down. When the team passed the corner, they heard a scream behind them. Well, they are here. Catch them. When the wild screaming died down, a hail of stones, arrows and spears fell into the team. David hid behind the corner at the last moment, avoiding the blade of the spear. Nanthornian deflected most of the projectiles with a long sword, but one stray arrow scratched Nathan painfully into his right hand. Celian also hid behind the bend next to David. I began to collect goblin arrows. Thank you for the delivery of the arrows, he cried out, then jumped out from behind the wall and started shooting at the monsters. Within a few seconds, he shot 8 monsters. Bodies of dead or wounded goblins blocked the rest of the army, but it lasted only a moment. Celian again had to flee due to lack of ammunition. The scout chose a good moment because just behind him flew another few shots. Celian took them as soon as possible, but he had no intention of shooting. The burglars again disappeared from the eyes of the goblins around the corner. Unfortunately for the team, it was the last corner. The rest of the tunnel stretched straight down. Shouted suddenly Nanthornian. David quickly threw himself to the ground with the others. A spear flashed quickly over the boy and an arrow hit his back. Fortunately, he was protected by hard armor hidden under his sweatshirt. David breathed a sigh of relief until suddenly a heavy stone hit his buttocks. The boy was writhing in pain. After a while, Another wave of arrows and stones hit them. Cordrin at the last second clung to the wall avoiding the arrowhead, but Poppin was hit in the head with a stone. The halfling's legs bent and after a while he fell unconscious to the ground. Bago, seeing that more plonked objects were approaching the victim, jumped towards him and covered him with his own body. Several arrows and stones stuck into his shield placed on his back. The round shield was very large, but the weak wood could not completely stop the sharp arrows, so the blades broke through the shield and wounded him in the back, but nothing serious happened. Bago quickly picked up his friend from the ground and ran on with the halfling under his arm. David also wanted to get up, but his ass hurt as if someone had shot him there with 1,000 times with Serama's belt. Fortunately, after a while, Nanthorin helped him get up. The giant, seeing that it would be difficult for David to walk, took him, like Bago Poppin, under his arm. The tunnel was so narrow that the boy scrubbed all the time with his left side against the wall. Nanthorin ran with the boy at the very end, being the most exposed to fire, and a few more arrows came from behind, but it bounced off the giant's armor. "I see a way out," cried Shtendrim running at the very front. "Faster!" Cordrin shouted. After a while, the team ran out of the tunnel and found themselves again on the collapsed bridge. Suddenly, in the back, upstairs, they heard more goblin squeaks. David could not turn in that direction under the armpit of the giant, but Nanthorin after a while looked in that direction himself. The boy saw enemies jumping off the rock. Immediately afterwards, the goblins also began to run out of the tunnel. The team began to flee further. Shtendrim was the first to jump 6 meters without any problems and then found himself on the other side of the collapsed bridge. Nanthorin let David go to the ground and began to fight the monsters in the face-to-hand. Seeing this, Celian decided to help the warrior with arrows from the bow. All the shots hit exactly in the heads of monsters, instantly killing them. Bago, on the other hand, showered his enemies with stones along with Turhin who, unlike the mudman, did it with his slingshot. David finally got up. He felt a little better, so he began to help 4 companions. He didn't do it perfectly, but he managed to hurt several enemies by preventing them from attacking. Suddenly, the team defending themselves as much as they could heard a scream behind them. David turned there and saw Shtendrim defending himself desperately on the other side of the bridge against the goblins. After a while, one of the goblins knocked the shadow warrior on his back. "Ne!" Bago cried at this sight. The goblin who knocked Shtendrim over, after a while picked him up and put him on his knees, facing his companions. Monster put a blade to the warrior's neck and 2 others held him and took away the weapon. "Toss your weapons or I'll cut off this human dog's head." Creature began to scream to the burglars so loudly that he began to choke. "I wonder why, and so these cowards will kill us." Nethin broke down. Bago's hand began to shake and then he tossed off his sword. Seeing this, Monster smiled. "Or do you want us to kill another dog?" asked the monster. "Maybe this warrior. Our lord told us to bring him," he added. When he said this, the goblins behind Nanthorin suddenly grabbed David. "Apparently this boy means a lot to you, Nanthorin. I guess you don't want this puppy to die," laughed the goblin standing on the other side. Hearing this, the warrior lowered his weapon. "No," screamed suddenly enraged David, then stuck his nails in the head of one of the monsters in a frenzy and then grabbed from the ground a thick wooden stick of a dead goblin. He hit him with another creature and after a while he took the momentum and threw his weapon at the 50-man squad. The thick stick hit centrally in the head of the monster, which pressed the knife to Shtendrim's throat. The impact deprived the monster of consciousness. Creatures stunned for a moment from the impression except for some. Nanthorin stabbed one of the monsters who wanted to get David from behind. Another goblin picked up a sword from the ground to cut off the shadow warrior's head. Seeing this, David was furious. He took a run and jumped the 6-meter gap separating him from his companion in danger. Goblins drew attention to the boy rising into the air. After a while, David landed at the very end of the collapsed structure and in a wild frenzy began to chop the monsters mercilessly. A few of them have already fallen into the abyss right away. Terrified monsters began to retreat so quickly. "Leave alone my friends, stop bullying you underdeveloped, stupid monsters." David began to scream, not knowing what he was saying. He continued to slay merciless monsters in defense of the warrior. Wild creatures began to flee, seeing that already half of them had died at the hands of an enraged young man. They felt clearly that the boy was not afraid of them. Shtendrim still continued to kneel on the ground, stunned, not knowing what was going on. A few monsters on the other side wanted to kill the unconscious Poppin, but Bago picked up a rod from the ground and swept the monsters off the bridge. After a while, the whole team began to fight again. David began to chase further monsters. He grabbed his diuretic folding bow and began to shoot. Within a moment, another 10 wounded or dead victims lay on the ground. In just 5 minutes, of the 50 monsters, only 15 escaped. David ran to the enemies and began to finish off their wounded goblins. When he finished, he started shooting at the other 15 enemies again. 3 were knocked off their feet and the others managed to escape and hide in one of the caves. The boy, seeing that he could not catch up with them and kill them, took a ladder leaning against one of the boulders and began to pull it with him towards the collapsed bridge. After a while, the team, stunned by the surprise, surrounded by dead monsters, saw David, who put an 8-meter ladder over the precipice, thus creating a kind of footbridge that allowed them to safely go to the other side. "Come on," the boy called to his comrades. Stendrim still continued to kneel, surprised, next to the boy who had just saved his life. "First the lightest," Nanthorin said. "And how do we take Poppin?" Terhin asked. "I'll take care of it," Cordrin replied, then picked up an unconscious friend from the ground and took him on his shoulder. After a while, he began to walk up the ladder over a dark precipice. The halfling struggled to keep his balance by the wounded Poppin, who pulled him to the side by his weight. Fortunately, he managed to cross safely to the other side. He fell on his soaring legs and began to quickly dress his friend's forehead. After Cordrin passed hurriedly Terhin, then passed Slim Celian, Nethin passed uncertainly, trying not to look down. As the penultimate one, Bago was to pass. Mudman walked a few steps until suddenly a rung broke under his leg. Bago quickly set foot on the next one, trying to regain his balance. The ladder creaked. At the last moment he jumped the last 3 meters and the ladder behind him broke off under his bouncing legs and fell broken in 2 parts into the abyss. On the other side there was only Nanthorin, but he easily jumped 6 meters, which were a little trifle for his long legs. After a while, the whole team was finally together again. "That what you did, David, was amazing," Stendrim finally said. Nanthorin swore out from behind one of the boulders and began to look to the sides. "Clear," he said quietly. Some of the team, including David, didn't even hear that short word. The giant moved on to the front and the others followed. In the distance they could still hear the screams and squeaks of the enraged goblins. "Look for them, Sirke," one of them tore his throat into the sky. "We have another supply of human-nets, another humanoids. Lead them to our lord. Maybe they know something about these escapees," screamed another goblin. "What?" David was surprised to hear it. "They courted more victims, there must needs to be something," Bago shouted, grabbing his cheeks and waking his eyes. "Yes, we must save these unfortunates," Nanthorin replied quietly. "What?" David wrote again. "And you are deaf?" Bago asked. "No, but," the boy began after for a moment he fell silent. "I thought that we would get out of here as soon as possible," he finished. "What you mean by this, is that you will leave those unfortunates in this smelly hole to their fate among those underdeveloped monsters and at least a brutal ruler." Nethin was outraged. Anne, no, that's not what I meant. That is, simply." David suddenly clogged again. "Never mind." Nethin got impatient. "We'd better find these unfortunates before Mirentagon starts asking them about us and they do something to them," he added immediately afterwards. "And behind him, Mirentagon will not throw them alive into this manure pit," Bago added solemnly. Nethin nodded. "The prisoners are probably on our right side from where we could hear the screams," Nanthorin said, turning toward his comrades. "Well, so let's go," Terhin shouted, then moved forward. "Wait. Stop," Nethin cried out, trying not to do it too loudly. The boy, however, did not pay attention to his friend's calls. He continued to run unreasonably, but courageously ahead, like a fast black panther hiding in the darkness of an old mine. The team decided to run after him. When they caught up with the boy, after a while a stray creature jumped out from behind the rocks. The nose of a monster, resembling a pig's snout, and it grabbed a stick in hand. When the goblin saw the 9 intruders, he made a sound like kind of interest. Oh, Terhin, seeing the behavior and ugliness of goblin, grimaced with disgust. The monster noticed the boy's reaction, so he smiled insincerely, revealing crooked teeth. "Oh," wrote a feral creature suddenly, then threw itself at Terhin with a long stick, in a hand as thin as a stick. Nanthornin literally stabbed the creature in the face between the eyes in a split second. In Terhin's eyes, who saw what had just happened, there was not only horror and disgust, but also disbelief. He wanted to defeat me down with a stick. He said to himself that no one but Nanthornin, who was closest to the boy, had heard him. Artificial intelligence, wild behavior, snorted David, also incredulous. Nathan directed the boy with his eyes as if he wanted to tell him that his jokes were absolutely not funny. Okay, so we're going, the young man replied hastily, wanting to avoid scolding eyes. He walked away a few steps and then stopped at the dead goblin. He twitched like a lightning bolt when he saw the monster's head pierced through, from which red and purple blood was seeping. I'm going, go. He began to scream, looking away from the unpleasant sight without knowing what he was even saying. The team followed him uncertainly. Everyone stared at the boy until he again twitched through the shivers passing through his body. Nanthornin overtook David so that he could go ahead. For the rest of the way, no one spoke, but everyone looked to the sides and backwards, expecting another attack of ugly creatures. Within a few minutes David twitched again, hearing a sudden scream, pulled them out of their cages. Faster, take the garbage to our lord. The goblin's scream came from behind a rock a few meters from David. The boy took off the hood, wiped his sweaty forehead and then looked out from behind the boulder. He was overcome with panic when he saw a 4-meter goblin by the wagons in which the prisoners were located, but when he turned his gaze to the battered prisoners behind bars, even the women and children, he felt like a desire for revenge. He wanted to hurt the merciless goblins just as they hurt the innocent. Suddenly, a huge monster with a black, twisted sword in his hand approached 2 carts filled with prisoners. You must tell our lord all that you know about your armed forces and the 9 escapees who have fled from here. The monster began to slump in a whimsical voice. We will only say all this if you promise to let us go, answered a young woman dressed in a ruffled coat. These cursed demons will not let us go anyway, the elderly man despaired, with a clear horror in his eyes. Hearing this, the 4-meter monster turned to the other creatures. Kill all the children, if they want to, let them, kill the rest later and throw it into the manure pit. One of the goblins, who had both his legs twisted, began to open the cages. Seeing this, a middle-aged woman hugged a small child tighter and began to sob. Another goblin, as if with a crushed nose, began to laugh like a savage monkey. David, leaning out from behind the rock, was no longer able to stand. He remembered how he had recently knocked down and chased away a bunch of monsters, saving Shtendrim from certain death. When he looked at the giant's goblin again, he also remembered how he knocked down Selith in a duel. Now he realized how much courage he had. Meanwhile, a crooked goblin with lopsided legs tried to pull out the first child, who was fiercely defended by men and women. The monster, seeing that it would not be easy, reached for the spiky club and began to beat the prisoners who were closest to him. Despite this, one of the women continued to bravely defend her little son. Another knife came up to the car trying to stab the child. Instead, the blade reached a young man who covered the baby with his own body. Seeing this, David finally fell into another indescribable fury. He began to tremble, or rather shake, in the sewage ambitions. Nanthornin noticed the boy's impatience, so he suddenly shouted at everyone on the team to hear him. Attack! David jumped automatically to the run, jumped off the rock, and after a while killed the first unsuspecting monster from above. Possessed monsters, you only deserve to die, he began to scream. All the prisoners, and the goblins, turned their eyes to the 9 armed daredevils. The team began to chop monsters without mercy. The giant beast was stunned with fear when it saw that in just a few seconds half of its dead soldiers were lying on the ground. The giant was most horrified by the boy in the white sweatshirt, who fought like a killing machine. Nanthornin, as always, overcame all monsters as if fighting insects. Celian fired accurately, killing everyone in one moment. Nethin and Terhin worked together. Gordrin threw knives with the Shadow Warrior, and Shtendrim himself slayed enemies with his sword. Bago, holding Poppin on his back, slowly regaining consciousness although he had a sword, but Muddy preferred to fight with a boulder. A large stone smashed the skulls of enemies like a giant hammer. The great goblin began to retreat in panic. Men and even some women began to come out of the cages using the confusion to help in the fight. Freed people began to pick up the weapons of fallen monsters from the ground to have something to defend and fight. The other wounded and the women protected the children and covered their eyes from the bloody slaughter. Goblin reinforcements began to arrive, but this was not a problem for the defenders. The giant goblin suddenly looked at the wagons containing the other elderly, the wounded, children and young mothers. The monster moved in that direction and reached for his sword. The same young man who had previously shielded the child with his own body noticed the danger coming and warned the others, but it was too late to escape. The giant wedged his body into the middle of the cage and drew his sword in front of him. People began to retreat backwards. One of the men began to beat the monster with a stick of the defeat goblin, but the giant, instead of starting to fight him, killed a wounded old man who was closest to him. "You cheap coward, you will pay for it, you monster!" Someone suddenly started screaming behind the monster's back. The 4-meter-high body stopped fighting with the defenseless and turned backwards. The goblin was horrified when he saw a boy twice as small, but he wasn't scared for any reason. There was not the slightest expression of fear in David's eyes, and his hands, wielding a long, blooded sword, fought in true fury and lust for justice. When the boy ran to the creature, he began to run away like a real coward. "You coward, I will kill you," David shouted. Hearing this, the goblin stopped behind the wagon and turned towards the enemy. "So you are going to fight with me, you cheap?" David did not finish his speech, because the monster cowardly kicked him suddenly, knocking him off his feet. David fell to the ground with a wail, and the monster raised his sword to kill him. So David rolled to the side, avoiding the first blow, but after a while the goblin stepped on him so that he could not move. When monster prepared for the next blow, however, something happened that David honestly did not expect. Nanthornin threw his sword and the blade stuck into the bald head of the giant goblin. Of course, the monster died instantly, but his body slumped over and hit the cart in which there were still people. The vehicle, due to the force of the impact, started to drive towards the dark abyss. David wiped his eyes as he saw what was happening in front of him. However, the car was speeding faster and faster and he could not do anything.